The sky was on fire. The first impact had taken out London. The second, Tokyo. The third, Washington, D.C. And still, no demands came. No transmission, no declaration of war. Just death from above. Elias Drake sat in the wreckage of what used to be an underground command bunker, the glow of orbital strikes reflecting in his cold, calculating eyes. Around him, remnants of Earth's last standing officers argued, their voices blending into a meaningless roar. He lit a cigarette with a shaking hand, watching the chaos unfold around him. "This isn't a war," someone was shouting. "This is extermination." Drake exhaled smoke, then spoke, low, sharp, cutting through the noise. "Then let's stop acting like we're fighting one." Silence. All eyes turned to him. One of the generals scoffed, his uniform charred and torn, eyes bloodshot with panic. "You think this is a debate, Drake? Half the planet's gone. We are outmatched. We don't even know who they are." Drake leaned forward, placing his cigarette down on the war table, its ember burning against the cracked steel surface. "They didn't come to negotiate. They didn't come to conquer." His voice was steady, unwavering. Cold as the grave. "They came to erase us." No one spoke. Drake slowly stood, his scarred hands pressing into the table, his gaze sweeping across the room, across men and women who had once commanded entire armies, now reduced to cornered animals, waiting to die. "I don't give a damn if we're outmatched," he growled. "We're humans. We don't go quietly." Silence stretched thick as smoke. Then, a faint crackle. A voice, cold, mechanical, echoed through the bunker's emergency transmission system. "Human species. Your existence has been deemed obsolete. The V-Dran Concord will cleanse your infestation. Do not resist." Drake stared at the speaker, his fingers twitching. A slow grin crept across his face. "You hear that?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone gulped. "What?" Drake crushed his cigarette beneath his boot. "They think we're infestation." His grin widened, sharp as a knife. "So let's give them a plague." 4 hours later. V-Dran assault troops descended onto Earth's surface, tall, biomechanical warriors with gleaming, armored exoskeletons, laser-edged blades protruding from their forearms. Efficient. Precise. Calculated. Their AI war models had already mapped Earth's inevitable surrender. Statistically, the humans should have broken within minutes. Instead, they met hell. A V-Dran squad pushed through the ruins of New York City, their scanning visors detecting nothing but dust and the occasional charred corpse. The streets were eerily silent. Too silent. Then, a whisper through their comms. "Welcome to Earth, Motherf." Boom. The first explosion ripped through the buildings, sending shockwaves through the enemy ranks. Before they could react, gunfire shredded through their formation, high-velocity bullets tearing through armor specifically designed for energy weapons, but useless against kinetic rounds. V-Dran warriors collapsed, screaming in confusion. The survivors tried to fall back, but the shadows came alive. Human soldiers emerged from the rubble, moving with terrifying speed, not soldiers, not warriors, but predators. One V-Dran turned just in time to see a masked figure leap from above, a serrated combat knife flashing in the dark. The last thing it heard was a whisper. "You should have stayed in the stars." The knife plunged deep. The V-Dran war computer, monitoring from orbit, flagged the battle as anomaly detected. Something was wrong. Humans weren't following logical engagement patterns. They weren't forming defensive lines or engaging in tactical retreats. They were hunting. They were enjoying it. Above the planet, aboard the V-Dran Command Dreadnought, Supreme Executioner VA Corps watched the chaos unfold through a holographic battlefield display. His optical sensors twitched. Something wasn't right. Human resistance was expected, brief, desperate, meaningless. Instead, his forces were being shredded. Not just by weapons. By fear. He turned to his second-in-command, his voice measured, mechanical. "Explain." The officer's synthetic vocalizer crackled. "They are behaving irrationally, my lord." Viecor's talons tightened against the railing. "Clarify." The officer hesitated. They do not retreat. They do not surrender. They are using strategies our data cannot predict." Viecor's gaze flickered to the battlefield display. The numbers were wrong. By all logic, by all precedent, human casualties should have been in the millions. Instead, their forces were growing. Like a virus. He turned sharply. "Deploy the orbital eradicator." The officer faltered. "My lord." "Now." The command was sent. Above Earth, the largest warship in the V-Dran fleet charged its planet-cracking cannon. A weapon that had erased entire civilizations before. The countdown began. Back on Earth, inside a hidden bunker beneath the ruins of DC, Drake leaned over a console, watching the weapon charge. Someone screamed. "They're gonna wipe us out." Drake didn't even blink. Instead, he cracked his knuckles, his voice calm. "We already planned for this." The room went dead silent. One of the officers swallowed. "We did?" Drake smirked, tapping a button. Above Earth, dozens of stolen V-Dran ships suddenly reactivated. From the outside, they were dead wrecks, destroyed in previous battles, seemingly forgotten in the orbit of the planet. But inside? Inside, they were rigged to the teeth with nuclear warheads. And they had just been remotely activated. The V-Dran warship never saw it coming. 1 second, the orbital eradicator was preparing to fire. The next, it was engulfed in nuclear hellfire. Inside the V-Dran dreadnought, Viecor watched the detonations bloom like dying stars. His warship lurched, alarms blaring. Impossible. This was impossible. A new transmission crackled through the bridge. It was human. And it was laughing. Then, a voice. "Drake. You thought we were insects." The V-Dran officers froze. "You thought we would run." The screen flickered, revealing Drake's grinning, scarred face. His next words sent a shiver through the entire warship. "Now it's our turn." The next wave of human forces launched. And for the first time in history, the V-Dran knew fear. The wreckage of the V-Dran flagship burned in the sky, broken pieces of its once mighty structure raining down onto the ruined cities below. The silence that followed was suffocating. A moment of stunned disbelief. Then, the transmission from the V-Dran High Command cut through the static. "All units, retreat to designated fallback positions. Earth is a level red battlefield. Do not engage further without tactical recalibration." They were afraid. Drake sat in the command bunker, listening to the intercepted transmission, his fingers drumming against the steel table. He could hear it in their voices. The V-Dran, the most advanced war machine the galaxy had ever seen, was second-guessing itself. A slow grin crept across his face. "They're running," someone whispered. Drake shook his head. "No," he muttered. "They're regrouping. Trying to figure out how the hell an inferior species just wiped out half their war fleet." One of his officers, bloody, breathing hard, stumbled forward, dropping a damaged V-Dran rifle onto the table. "We got lucky," he panted. "That was one ship." Drake's grin widened. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said, standing up, his voice calm, razor sharp. "We aren't lucky. They're unlucky. Because they just ran headfirst into the single most dangerous force in the universe." The officer frowned. "What force?" Drake leaned forward. "A species that doesn't know when to quit." The bunker door slammed open. A scout rushed in, his face pale beneath layers of dirt and sweat. "Commander," he gasped, "we've got movement." V-Dran ground forces advancing again. Bigger. Heavier. "They're throwing everything at us." Drake exhaled. The first wave had been an extermination mission. No prisoners, no negotiation. Just shock and awe orbital strikes meant to erase humanity in hours. That plan had failed spectacularly. Now, the VE Dran were playing by different rules. They were sending shock troopers, dread mechs, planetary artillery. Drake cracked his knuckles. "Good," he said. "Let's see what they're really made of." He grabbed his rifle and marched out. The city was a graveyard. Towering buildings, once symbols of human progress, lay in shattered ruins. Smoke and fire curled into the darkened sky. The streets, once filled with life, now reeked of blood and burning metal. Drake stood on the rooftop of a collapsed skyscraper, watching the VE Dran war columns move into position. Their ranks were perfect, unwavering formations of cybernetic warriors, artillery walkers crushing debris beneath them, their warships hovering just above, ready to rain fire from the skies. Their technology was flawless. Their strategy was impeccable. It wouldn't be enough. His earpiece crackled. "They've got us outnumbered 20-1, his second-in-command muttered. "This is suicide." Drake chuckled. "That's what makes it fun." Then he lifted his radio and spoke to the waiting human forces below. "All units, hold the line," he said. "I want them to get comfortable. Make them think they've got us pinned." "What happens then?" Drake's grin turned feral. "Then we rip their throats out." The first shot cracked the air. The battle erupted. The VE Dran advanced with unrelenting force, their pulse cannons sending shockwaves through the streets, carving deep craters into the earth. Their dread mechs lumbered forward, each a walking fortress of steel and plasma. But the humans didn't fight like soldiers. They fought like predators. Hidden snipers tore through VE Dran command units, targeting officers with inhuman precision. Explosives rigged to collapsed buildings brought entire battalions crashing down in a single instant. The first wave of VE Dran troopers stormed into the city's ruins, only to find themselves being pulled into alleyways, one by one, screaming as unseen hands dragged them into the darkness. Panic spread through the VE Dran ranks. They had fought countless wars. They had wiped civilizations from existence without breaking formation. But this wasn't war. This was a nightmare. A VE Dran warrior, his armor dented and splattered with gore, staggered through the wreckage of a fallen tank. His comms were filled with garbled screams, his squad was gone. Cut down in seconds. His sensors flickered, trying to track movement, but the humans were everywhere and nowhere. Then he saw it. A single man, standing in the middle of the street, alone. Elias Drake. The VE Dran warrior raised his plasma rifle, sensors locking onto the target. A simple shot. No chance of failure. Drake smirked. And threw down a smoke grenade. The battlefield vanished into a choking cloud of darkness. The VE Dran hesitated, just a second. That was all it took. A knife slammed into his throat. Drake whispered in his ear. "Welcome to the jungle." The body collapsed. From the rooftops, the hidden human strike teams poured from the shadows. The smoke lifted, revealing the ambush in full force. The tide turned. Humans moved with terrifying speed, wielding captured alien weapons, turning VE Dran technology against them. Mechs toppled as hacked war drones turned on their own armies. VE Dran commanders screamed as suicidal human shock squads breached their barricades. Within minutes, the VE Dran war front collapsed. Drake stood among the bodies, blood dripping from his blade. He looked up at the VE Dran warship still hovering above, no doubt watching, analyzing, recalculating. He wiped his knife on his sleeve and clicked his radio. "Hey, High Command." Static. Then a reply. A voice, deep, mechanical, laced with irritation. "This is Supreme Executioner VA Corps." "Speak, human." Drake chuckled. "You ever hear of a game called chess?" Silence. "It's an old human game," Drake continued. "Lot of strategy, lot of thinking ahead. You'd like it." But there's one move in particular I think you'd appreciate. VA Corps' voice was a low growl. Explain. Drake raised his hand. His fingers hovered over a detonator switch. He looked up. At the V-Dran command warship. You ever hear of a checkmate? And then he pressed the button. Above them, the V-Dran flagship exploded. A dozen hidden nuclear payloads, buried beneath V-Dran landing zones, rigged to detonate when their fleet least expected it, detonated in perfect unison. The shockwave ripped the skies apart. The once mighty V-Dran war force disintegrated in an instant. Drake stood, watching the wreckage rain down. The radio crackled. VA Corps' voice, laced with fury. You will suffer for this. Drake laughed. Buddy, he said, grinning as flames reflected in his eyes. You already are. The battlefield was silent, but not because the war was over. Silence was the sound of fear, the moment between breaths before chaos returned. The V-Dran forces had retreated for now, but everyone knew they would be back. Stronger. Smarter. And angry. Drake sat on the hood of a wrecked tank, wiping dried blood from his face. The night sky burned with the remains of the V-Dran flagship, shattered debris streaking across the horizon like falling stars. Someone handed him a radio. The transmission was patchy, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. This is Supreme Executioner VA Corps, the words dripped with fury. You believe yourself victorious? This is but a delay. Your people are still insects. You will beg for extinction before we are done. Drake exhaled slowly, tilting his head, his fingers tapping idly against his knee. You know, he said casually, every time you talk, you sound more and more like a Saturday morning cartoon villain. You ever think about getting a new script? A pause. You amuse yourself, VA Corps growled. Enjoy it while you can. Drake's grin was sharp as broken glass. Oh, I am. Trust me. But let me explain something to you, VA Corps. He leaned forward, voice dropping. I know how this works. You're regrouping. You're recalculating. You're adjusting strategy because for the first time in your life, you're not the one holding the leash. You expected an extermination, and instead, you got a war. War? VA Corps scoffed. You are fighting against inevitability. Drake chuckled. Let me ask you something. Have you ever fought something that wouldn't die? That just kept getting back up no matter how many times you crushed it. That's humanity. We are cockroaches with shotguns, my guy. You can outgun us, out-tech us, hell, even outnumber us. But you will never outlast us. The line was quiet for a long time. Then, a slow, deliberate response. Then we shall break your spirit instead. The radio cut off. Drake tossed it aside and stood. The air felt heavier now. Something was coming. A scout ran up, panting, dirt smeared across his face. Commander, we have a problem. Drake raised an eyebrow. Just one? The V-Dran have changed tactics. The scout swallowed. They're not sending warships this time. They're sending hunters. Drake's grin faded. That was new. They've deployed something called Reapers. Cloak strike teams. Surgical assassins. They're not attacking in waves anymore. Drake cracked his knuckles. Ah. They got tired of fighting armies and decided to play in the shadows. He nodded, processing. Good. They're learning. That makes this more fun. The scout hesitated. Sir, these things, they're not standard infantry. They don't engage directly. They don't fight fair. Drake laughed, shaking his head. Neither do we. The first death came within the hour. A sentry, stationed 3 floors up in a half-destroyed office building, found with his throat slit, his rifle untouched. Then another. Then another. The bodies were found in impossible places, hanging from streetlights, hidden in sewer grates, stuffed into air vents. There was no pattern, no rhythm. Just slaughter. Drake stood over one of the bodies, his jaw tight. The cuts were surgical. Precise. Efficient. The VE Dran were done fighting like soldiers. Now they were hunting like predators. The next few hours were chaos. Reports of shadows moving between ruins, soldiers vanishing mid-patrol, radios cutting out mid-sentence. The fear was spreading, crawling up spines like ice. Drake gathered his men in a darkened war room, the light from a cracked holographic display flickering across their grim faces. "All right," he said, voice calm. "Let's break this down. They're trying to spook us. That means they think fear is a weapon." He smirked. "That's adorable." An officer clenched his fists. "Sir, they are a weapon. These things don't miss." Drake rolled his shoulders. "Neither do we." He turned to his second-in-command. "Call up every single sniper team we have left. I want every rooftop covered. Night vision, thermal, motion sensors, hell, I don't care if they have to start throwing rocks. No blind spots." Another soldier frowned. "That still won't stop them from picking us off one by one." Drake's grin returned, sharp and knowing. "Yeah. Which is why we're going to bait them." The room was silent. Then someone asked the obvious. "How?" Drake cracked his neck. "We're going to make ourselves the prey." The next hour was spent setting the trap. Soldiers moved in pairs, making just enough noise to be noticed. Certain buildings were deliberately left unguarded, with seemingly weak patrols moving in and out. And then they waited. The first Reaper took the bait almost immediately. A black figure dropped from the shadows, moving so fast that the human soldier barely had time to scream. But before it could land the killing strike, 4 snipers opened fire at once, cutting it down mid-motion. The second and third fell in similar ways, drawn to movement, exposed by coordinated traps, gunned down in an instant. But the fourth? The fourth got close. Drake was the bait. He stood in the open, seemingly alone, his back turned. The air shifted behind him. A presence, silent, deadly. The VE Dran Reaper lunged, its razor-sharp blade aiming for Drake's throat. Drake moved faster. He pivoted, catching the Reaper's wrist mid-air, twisting with brutal efficiency. The sound of snapping bone was sharp and quick, followed by a deafening gunshot. The Reaper hit the ground, its cloak flickering out, revealing its insectoid form, eyes wide in shock. Drake kneeled beside it, pressing his boot against its shattered chest. "You really thought that was gonna work?" he muttered, shaking his head. The Reaper hissed, its voice barely audible. "We do not fear you." Drake smirked, leaned in close. "That's the problem." He pressed the barrel of his pistol against its skull. "You should." The shot echoed. The last Reaper was dead. The attack stopped. The VE Dran had lost again. Drake dusted off his hands, standing over the corpse, looking up at the VE Dran fleet hovering in the distance. He could almost feel their frustration. The radio crackled. It was VA Corps. "This is impossible," the warlord snarled. "We have crushed entire empires. You are a backwater species." "How?" Drake grinned, voice calm. "We adapt," he said simply. A beat of silence. Then, for the first time since the war began, VA Corps' voice carried something that wasn't anger or arrogance. "Doubt. You will pay for this," the VE Dran warlord growled. Drake's grin widened. "Buddy," he said, wiping blood from his hands. "We already cashed the check." He tossed the radio aside and walked away. The war wasn't over. But this battle? This battle belonged to humanity. The aftermath of the ambush left the battlefield drenched in blood, smoke curling through the ruins of shattered buildings. The last Reaper lay dead at Drake's feet, its metallic carapace reflecting the fires burning in the distance. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts. The humans had done what no other species had ever done before, they had outmaneuvered the VE Dran on their own terms. The radio crackled again, the connection rough, but the anger behind it clear. "This defies all logic." VA Corps' voice was a low, controlled growl. "Your species is a statistical anomaly. This is not war. This is chaos." Drake rolled his shoulders, smirking at the sheer frustration in the alien warlord's voice. "Yeah, well, war isn't a game of numbers, buddy. It's a game of nerves. And guess what? You're losing yours." A pause. Then, slow, deliberate breathing. "This will not happen again." "Oh, it definitely will," Drake said, casually reloading his sidearm. "See, you're fighting like this is some kind of scripted strategy match. We fight like rabid dogs. You send a fleet? We blow it up. You send troops? We gut them in the streets. You send assassins? We hang their heads from the rooftops." He exhaled sharply. "You're not dealing with an army, VA Corps. You're dealing with us." The transmission cut abruptly. Drake grinned. He could almost see the VE Dran warlord pacing back and forth in his sleek, sterile war room, struggling to process a reality where humans refuse to play by the rules. The grin faded as he turned to his second-in-command. "What's the movement report?" The officer shifted, glancing at the blood-stained maps spread across the table. "VE Dran forces are still on the ground, but they've stopped advancing. It's like they're hesitating." Drake nodded. "Good. That means they're afraid." One of the scouts, still covered in soot, cleared his throat. "They don't get afraid, sir. They do now." The room was tense. They all knew what was coming next. The VE Dran weren't retreating because they'd accepted defeat. They were pulling back because they were preparing something bigger. Drake could feel it, the air thick with the weight of an inevitable counterstrike. "They're going to try to erase the problem," he said, cracking his knuckles. "Us?" The officer's expression darkened. "You think they'll go for planetary bombardment again?" "No," Drake shook his head. "That didn't work. They need us gone, but they also need the planet intact. Otherwise, this whole war front becomes a waste." He exhaled. "Which means they're going for the nuclear option." The room went still. Someone swallowed. "Orbital sterilization? Worse." Drake clenched his fists. "They're gonna terraform us out of existence." A stunned silence stretched between them. One of the younger soldiers ran a shaky hand through his hair. That's insane. That would take." "They have the tech," Drake cut in. "A planetary transformation device. High-intensity biorestructuring. They'll pump the atmosphere full of engineered particles, strip away our oxygen, replace it with whatever the hell their species thrives on." The officer's face paled. "They'd kill everything." Drake smirked darkly. "Yeah. Efficient, isn't it?" The room fell into grim contemplation. The VE Dran were done playing. If they couldn't beat humans in combat, they'd simply reshape the battlefield until survival became impossible. Drake leaned forward, placing his palms on the table. "All right. We've got one shot at this. They'll have a control station, some kind of central hub where they're managing this transformation process." His voice sharpened. "We find it. We destroy it. We send a message." His second-in-command narrowed his eyes. "What kind of message?" Drake grinned. "That if they keep pushing us, we won't just survive their war. We'll steal it." The plan formed quickly. Intel reports came flooding in, pinpointing the control station's likely location, an underground structure buried beneath the remains of what used to be a government facility. He strapped on his combat gear, checked his rifle, and gave one final order before stepping into the battlefield. "Leave none of them alive." The assault began under the cover of darkness. The human strike teams moved in calculated silence, slipping through the VE Dran perimeter with ruthless precision. There were no warnings. No slow build-up. Just war. Gunfire erupted as the first wave of guards fell, their bodies crumpling under the weight of kinetic rounds. the air filled with the scent of burning metal and blood. Explosives were placed along the outer walls, rigged with timers. Drake led from the front, moving like a predator through the wreckage. His blade found its mark in the throat of an unsuspecting VE-Dran technician, the creature gurgling as it collapsed. Inside, the facility buzzed with unnatural energy, towering machines pulsing with alien light. And there, at the heart of it all, stood the control console. VA Core's voice crackled over the speakers. "I expected nothing less from you." Drake wiped blood from his cheek. "I like that you're finally learning. You will not destroy this facility in time." Drake arched a brow. "Wanna bet?" He pulled a detonator from his belt, holding it up for the security cameras to see. "Because I came prepared." VA Core's hesitation was palpable. "You are bluffing." Drake grinned. "You're really bad at this." He pressed the detonator. Explosions ripped through the facility, fire bursting from the ground as the entire structure trembled. The mainframe shattered, sparks flying in all directions. The war had just changed again. Drake exhaled, standing amid the destruction. "You're done here," he said to the smoldering wreckage of the VE-Dran tech. "Pack up your toys and go home." The radio flickered to life again. VA Core's voice was slower now, quieter. "You truly believe you can end this war?" Drake's smirk faded. He turned toward the sky, watching the distant glow of VE-Dran warships hovering just beyond the stratosphere. "No," he admitted. "But I sure as hell can make you regret starting it." The transmission ended. The battle was over. But the war had only begun. And humanity? Humanity was just getting started.